Aniket Kali. Aniket is a research assistant, maps and data visualization at the School of Cities, part of the University of Toronto. It's a unique multidisciplinary hub for urban research, education, and engagement, creating new and just ways for cities and their residents to thrive. And so with that, let's have a big welcome for Aniket.
Amazing. Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. Can the online people hear me? Okay, I'm seeing some reaction. Great. So my name is Aniket. I work at the School of Cities. Who here knows the School of Cities? A couple of people? Okay, cool. So I work there as a research assistant, and a lot of our work is kind of public-facing stuff around maps and data visualization. I think Jeff Allen, who's my boss, has been here once or twice before, so some folks might know him and his work. The project I'll be presenting about today is looking at how immigrants in the GTA have really changed voting patterns over the past few decades. It's tied to a research project we funded. But before I get into that, I just want to talk about, so we do a lot of maps and data viz stuff. There's stuff here. Jeff used this slide in another presentation, and one of my coworkers called it a charcuterie board of maps. But we do a lot of different kinds of little projects, whether that's around urban infrastructure, rail transit, population, heat, voting, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. I'd recommend you take a look at our website if you're interested in that. Before I get into this, there's an affiliated link, a website that we publish for this project. If folks are interested, you can follow along on the QR code and the URL. I'll give people a moment to open that if they'd like to. But I will be talking about everything that is linked on this website as well. Okay. So I'll have two parts in this presentation, basically just what is it we actually found when we're talking about changes in voting patterns. And then for those who are more technically inclined, I'll talk about the data and how we set it up. So one of the biggest things we found, and I think, I was talking with someone earlier who's kind of heard this or seen this anecdotally, I've certainly seen this in my own family as well, is that a lot of immigrants or immigrant-heavy ridings in the Greater Toronto Area tend to skew much more conservative now. And that's quite a change when we look at the data from before. This is a very neat scatter plot, which really just shows that, a riding that used to have more immigrants would vote less conservative by rule. And now it's the complete opposite in Ontario's provincial elections for the Greater Toronto Area. We see the same thing happen at the federal level, but it's a bit less pronounced. And, so this is one of the graphs that we have available on the website that I linked to earlier, but you can really see how it's a really dynamic kind of change over time. The rise in the conservatives that we've seen is quite recent, but it's not coming out of nowhere. It's been a steady climb over the last 20, 30 years. By looking at the data over decades, though, we can really get an idea of how, immigrants have really supported different parties or aligned in different kind of political alignments at different periods. This is provincially, and we can see for a time it was the Liberals. Before that, it was the NDP. When we look federally, we can see like the Liberals have really won in immigrant-heavy ridings for basically the last 50, 60 years without challenge until last month's election, or this month. And over here, we still see the same kind of trend. And I think what's interesting here is that we were able to do this by looking at both voting data and census data and kind of combine them together in the GTA to see what kind of trends emerge when we take the correlation between both of them over time. But I think for a few key takeaways, if nothing else, the kind of big things that stand out here are, in the 70s and 80s, the Ontario NDP was really successful in winning over immigrant-heavy ridings. The Liberals have really always, until very recently, kind of been very, very successful in these kinds of ridings. And until recently, It's basically been a fact that if you're in a very immigrant-heavy riding, the riding would not go conservative. And that's really flipped around. Like I said, now it's much more common that these very immigrant-heavy ridings in Brampton and Markham, Northern Scarborough are quite strongholds of the Conservative Party, especially at the provincial level. So I'll walk through some of these examples because I think this data is really instructive because it allows us to take different levels of nuance. So, that graph I showed you earlier, it was good at kind of talking through the very high level trends, what we've seen over different decades in the region as a whole. But we also produced some maps, which are on the website, and you can pick any election in either level of Ontario or federally from about 1961 to present day, and you can look at and compare vote share and different demographic variables such as percent immigrants, percent visible minorities, and average household income. The data set, which is linked on the website, also has a couple other variables. It's at the bottom of the page for those who are interested. But I'll walk through some of these trends I noted in a little bit more detail. And what we see here in the case of the Ontario NDP is their success with immigrants is very geographically contained. In the 70s, even in 1990, which was their greatest success in Ontario, it's kind of locked to the west side of the Humber River. The kind of failure of the NDP that we see in the data is that they were never able to make an inroad into the suburbs where, as the 80s and 90s went on to present day, many, many immigrants have settled in Mississauga, Brampton, Markham, parts of Scarborough, and the NDP has never had a presence here. Their success with immigrants was really, Italian, Portuguese immigrants, more white immigrants who kind of went up from Parkdale to Davenport to Black Creek area. In contrast, we can see, through this long-term trend graph, the correspondence to different major policy points of the. I'm sorry? Oh, my bad. Thanks for pointing that out. Please, someone yell at me if there's no slides moving again. But here's the photo I was just talking about regarding the Ontario NDP. Here, with the federal Liberals, we can see, as Pierre Trudeau enacted multiculturalism in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that really corresponds to success of the federal Liberals in these very immigrant-heavy ridings, which is, makes sense from one perspective as well. And more recently, we've seen the Conservatives start to win over large swaths of voters in immigrant-heavy ridings. And again, I think this points to kind of the ability of quantitative data to say something's happening, but also the limit in that we can't exactly say why it's happening. And there's been some, I think, pretty instructive reporting on this in detail, which is linked above. I think in the Briar Patch, as well as the Local, kind of looking at how the Conservatives have very deliberately spoken to different issues, particularly in Chinese and South Asian Canadian communities. The School of Cities funded a research paper which looked at second-generation immigrants, and a lot of them kind of disillusioned with high cost of living, lack of home affordability, lack of future and stability in jobs, kind of looked at how a lot of second-generation immigrants who I think as young people are traditionally seen as more progressive have also kind of drifted a lot more to the Conservative Party, who is ostensibly speaking to some of the feelings that they have. But I think there's also a big side here, which is that many people don't vote in these ridings, and that's a big limitation of this data. I mean, I think in Ontario's provincial elections turn out something like 40%, A lot of people can't vote if you're an immigrant and new here, if you're a student, if you don't have citizenship yet. That isn't accounted for here, but those are people who still have opinions and thoughts on how society should or shouldn't be. And another thing here, of course, is, the question of who is it that's voting or who is it that's participating. That tends to be people who are wealthier, tends to be people more educated, more plugged in to civic institutions. And of course, our data doesn't account for that directly either. So, this is just one kind of slice of the picture, but there's a lot more to be accounted for there. Now, before we get to Q&A, I just want to walk through the technical side for anyone who's quite interested in that. Basically, for constructing this data set, we wanted for every election from the 1960s onward, and for every riding, the vote percent for each party, and the percent of immigrants or percent of population that are immigrants. And that might be another variable. You can also look at visible minority, you can look at income, you can look at specific ethnicities, and so on and so forth. But this data isn't available in the census at a per riding level until about 2011, I want to say. And so the thing we kind of used is that there is census data available from about the 1950s for every neighborhood, and you can look at different demographic variables. We used a method called aerial interpolation. And so if you imagine the picture on the left as different neighborhoods and the number of immigrants in each neighborhood, for example, and the picture on the right is being just a single geographic riding, you can kind of just overlay them on each other and get an approximation. So you know that block with 100 is fully in the riding, so you count it fully. The block with 25 is half in the riding, so you count half of it, and so on and so forth. It's an approximation, but when we compare it to census data that is existing at the riding level that's much more recent, it's very close. And all this data is published online at the link I shared earlier, and I'll share at the end. It's at the very bottom of the page in the GitHub repository for anyone who's interested in working with this data further. For data sources, we used a couple different things, basically all things sourced back to Elections Ontario and Elections Canada. There's this guy, Lucas, who compiled the elections data in a very nice to work with way. So I used his version of it, but it's just Elections Canada. There was a large geographic research project at Western University that compiled a lot of census data at different levels. It's called UniCen is the project name. So that's what we use to collect census data. And then there's this guy who makes maps online at this website called electionatlas.ca, and he has manually drawn every map of every election in every province going back to 1890. So I just downloaded his maps and used that for this project as well. For the website itself, which I'll show you, for those who are familiar with more technical things, use Svelte. It's a very simple way of just making different components and having a very easy to create website that you can make very quickly. Now, I'll just walk through the website very quickly. So this is the website affiliated to the project that we put out. And when we do something at School of Cities, it's always like a couple of interactive graphs or maps or some kind of visualized data with some accompanying story to it. It can be longer or shorter, depending on who's writing it and what's it for. But I think the more interesting thing here, and the thing that people might want to look at later is, we can see really any election we want and how different parties have performed in those elections against different census variables as well. We uploaded the recent federal election data just after the election as well, though this article was written before that. So, all the text kind of reflects the world before the election and kind of assumptions and guesses before that. Otherwise, you can also look at this at a granular level as well. Any riding you can hover over and see whatever variable you'd like. And like I said, at the bottom in data and methods, there is the data set linked here for anyone who's interested in using it for anything else. Like I said, we have immigrants, visible minorities, income. I think we also computed for South Asian and Chinese Canadian per riding from about 2001 onwards, which is when that data is available. There might be one or two more things in there. But yeah, I think the kind of main thing to keep in mind, though, is, there's a lot we can learn from data analysis as always, but there are real limits there as well. I think there's a real gap that qualitative studies and journalism can also fill. But, I think just looking around the room and looking around the city, immigrants are a very major political constituency in the GTA as well. I think the way that they vote does really sway the way the region votes as a whole, as I think this project really illustrates. So Yeah, that is all. If you want to look at the website, it's here. Otherwise, I'm glad to take any questions about anything I've talked about.